Now that session management is enabled in our application, we have access to another persistent scope, which is the session scope. In a very little while, we will use this new scope to store information about the logged-in user. But first, it is important to emphasize the difference between the authentication process and the authorization process. When a user logs into an application, it basically identifies himself to the system. After the user is logged in, the application knows who the user is, and that is the authentication process. Authorization is another process. It's a process by which the application grants or denies the user access to a particular resource. If your site contains public pages that can be browsed by any user, the application grants access to some pages even though no user has authenticated. This is an example of authorization without authentication. On the contrary, an application can deny access to a particular resource to a logged-in user that does not have the right access privilege. In this second example, authorization fails, even though a user has successfully authenticated to the application. In our application, we will have 3 levels of access. The first level is the visitor level. This level of access does not require the user to authenticate. A visitor has access to every public pages of our website. The second level is the user level. Now, this level requires the user to authenticate. Users have the same access as visitors, plus an access to their profile. This enables any musician of the band to change its password, the contact information, and so on. So each musician of the band is registered as a user in our website and has that user level of access. The third level is the administrator level. This level of access also requires, of course, the user to authenticate. An administrator has the same access as a user, plus access to the administrative application of the site that you will develop later in this course. So the first thing that we will focus on is the authentication process, which uses the form at the top right corner of the site. Now, this is how the process will take place. First, the user fills his email address and his password in the form and, of course, submits the form. After a rapid data validation, client-side and server-side, we will use the user's email address and the user's password to retrieve the user data from the database using a CF query. We will then check if the query returns one and only one record. If no records, or if more than one records gets returned, then the authentication process cannot take place and an error should be sent back to the user. If the query returns one and only one record, we can log the user in, and this is done by storing the user's data in the session scope. When the user has successfully logged in, the top right corner of the site will not display the login form anymore, but a welcome message along with 2 links, a link to the user's profile and a logout link. If the user is an administrator, a third link should be displayed, which is a link to the site administration application. In the next video, we will start to implement the authentication process of our application.